A lot of people see anxiety and creativity as enemies, but this mindset is very often the thing that gets in the way of us being more creative. If you can learn to change your relationship to anxiety, you can harness it to increase your creativity and feel less anxious along the way. Here are 3 suggestions for doing just that. Number 1, work in stranger places. Now, if you struggle to be more creative, either because of things like procrastination, self-doubt, limiting beliefs, or other similar factors, you can probably relate to the feeling of getting anxious as soon as you sit down to work on a creative project. Maybe it's writer's block, when you sit down at your desk to work on your new book that you're writing. Maybe it's imposter syndrome when you get into your creative meeting with your team at work. Or maybe it's procrastination when you go into your studio at home in the garage to paint and you end up, organizing painting supplies instead of actually painting. In all these cases, though, it's possible that you've unconsciously associated your workplace with anxiety. Here's how this works. When you repeatedly get anxious starting work on a creative project, your brain associates that anxiety with the environment. Then, if you continue to get anxious in that same environment, your brain starts to anticipate that something bad is going to happen there. Now, the second you enter that environment, your anxiety gets triggered automatically, not because you're actually worried about something necessarily, but simply because you've conditioned yourself to be anxious in that environment. Luckily, you can undo this association and enhance your creativity by employing a really simple but effective strategy, and that is work in stranger places. So let's say you sit down to work on your novel, but you immediately start feeling anxious. Probably it's that classically conditioned response. And so you start thinking about procrastinating. Use that anxiety in this situation as a cue not to keep worrying, but as a cue to shift your working environment. So maybe you pack up your laptop and you go to a coffee shop and you write from there. You get your notebook and you go sit in your favorite park and journal about ideas for the book. You could even, this makes me think of a former client of mine, you could get a season pass. This was crazy. This client of mine, she got a season pass to her favorite art museum in town, and she would go and work on her book in the museum. She would go to her favorite room of the museum, sit down on one of those little benches, pull out her laptop, and start typing away, surrounded by all this gorgeous art. A great idea, great example of working in stranger places. So instead of fighting with or criticizing or resisting your anxiety, the idea here is to use it as a prompt to work in a new environment that doesn't have all that built up anxiety and guilt and frustration that your typical workplace might. So if you do this for a while, the association between your normal workplace and the anxiety will then start to dissolve. Just make sure that if you do this, you acknowledge and validate your anxiety briefly before moving to a new location, because you want to avoid intensifying the anxiety through avoidance. Number 2, reframe anxiety as adrenaline. Biologically speaking, anxiety is basically just adrenaline. When your body perceives a threat, not even necessarily a real threat, it just perceives that there might be a threat, it activates your fight or flight system by releasing adrenaline, which causes all sorts of physiological sensations like your heart rate increases, faster breathing rate, muscle tension, even that feeling of knots in your stomach. All that comes from a little bit of fight or flight activation, which is set off by adrenaline. And while those feelings are all uncomfortable, they're not dangerous. That's really key to see. In fact, adrenaline and your sympathetic nervous system getting activated, they are performance enhancers. Adrenaline improves reaction time and cognitive processing, increased breathing rate and heart rate, brings more oxygen to your muscles, and muscle tension makes it much easier to make quick, decisive action. Now, you might not need increased blood flow to your extremities, for instance, in order to be a better painter. But the point is just that it's not dangerous. Even if your brain gets a little confused and thinks that you worrying about what someone at your next art show is going to think about you and your painting, even if your brain misperceives that as a threat, the point is it's not actually dangerous. And you need to teach your brain that it's not dangerous by not acting like it is. Most people, they feel anxious and then they start catastrophizing and worrying about their anxiety. or getting self-critical of it. And it's this compound anxiety that interferes really with your creativity and your thinking. But if you can reframe that initial burst of anxiety as totally normal and even potentially helpful, something like, it's just my body giving me a little adrenaline so I can perform better, you can avoid that second layer of crippling anxiety and benefit from the performance and even creative enhancing aspects of that initial adrenaline burst or anxiety. So if you're working on a creative project and you start feeling anxious, try to hold off on your default response, either to criticize the anxiety or to worry about the anxiety or just to avoid it altogether. And instead, reframe your anxiety as adrenaline, which is trying to help you, not hurt you. Number 3, make time to worry on purpose. For many creative types, their biggest obstacle to creativity is that they just get in their head too much, and they frequently get lost in their own worries about not being good enough or what other people will think and all sorts of stuff like that, right? The problem is this chronic worrying, it generates tons of excess anxiety, which can then be paralyzing and directly interfere with your ability to consistently do the work of being creative. Thankfully, chronic worry is not inevitable. And with a little bit of a mindset shift, you can actually start to channel the energy of worry into your creative work. Before we get into how to do that, there's a key idea you have to come to terms with, and that is a worry is different than worrying. It's inevitable that worries will sometimes pop into your mind. And frankly, there's just nothing you can do to control that. But the occasional worry will not actually lead to that much anxiety or be that disruptive to your creative practice. What really interferes with creativity and generates boatloads of anxiety is the mental habit of worrying in response to that initial worry. For example, let's say a worry pops into your head during a meeting that if you share your new creative idea, one of your colleagues will think you're dumb and not respect you, something like that. But then in response to that worry, you start elaborating on it in your head with more worries. Oh, he's going to tell the boss I shouldn't even be on the team. Then I'll get kicked off this project. I'll lose out on my favorite part of this job. Hell, I don't know. I might even get fired. And then I'll never be able to get a job that's as good as this again. I'm going to be so screwed. ... The solution to this is to stop giving into or fighting with that initial worry and instead harness its energy to be more creative. Because if you think about it, worry is a very energetic and sometimes surprisingly imaginative and creative way of thinking. It's just that it's moving in a very negative and unproductive direction a lot of the time. But if you could direct that energy towards something more productive and creative, you could get the best of both worlds, less anxiety and more creativity. Now, in order to harness worries productively, though, you need to change your relationship with them. Instead of seeing them as a threat or something bad and dangerous, you need to learn to treat them like a friend that's making a suggestion. And even if that suggestion isn't true or is unhelpful, your kind of worry brain still has your best intentions at heart. So to do this, to start to create a friendlier rather than combative relationship with your worries, there's a great exercise and practice called scheduled worry. Now, scheduled worry means you make some time every single day to write down your worries on paper. And while it can feel kind of cathartic to get those worries out of your head down onto paper, the real magic of this exercise is that it transforms your relationship with worry from enemy to friend. See, instead of fighting with or running away from your worries, which just teaches your brain that worries are dangerous and threats and enemies, when you deliberately approach your worries with an exercise like scheduled worry, your brain learns the opposite lesson, that worries, while a little bit uncomfortable, they're not bad or dangerous. And if you do this repeatedly, your entire relationship with worry and anxiety will start to change for the better. You'll be able to briefly just sort of acknowledge your worries calmly and then refocus that energy, harness it, into whatever your creative goal or project is. If you want to learn more about a scheduled worry practice, I put together a brief quick start guide to scheduled worry. It's got step-by-step instructions and examples and frequently asked questions. I will put a link to download that free PDF in the notes below. All right, if you enjoyed this video, I've got another one I think you'll really like. It's called 3 Psychological Reasons Why You Procrastinate. So Obviously, anxiety and worry can get in the way of your creativity, but so can procrastination. And so if you want to understand kind of the deep root causes of procrastination and why we do it, I think this video will be really helpful, and you can check it out right here.